I'm Diana Rose, music director, member of Bet Aleph since 1999, when I was only 2 or 3. Anyway, I'm going to give the Devar the talk tonight. The parasha is Pinchas. Now, there's several events that happen in this portion. Now, if you remember, the whole portion thing came later when they realized, in the diaspora, and they had to want everyone to be able to remember what was in the Torah, and then they divided it up into sections to cover, so much every week. It's interesting, though, because sometimes how they divided it was interesting because it would be like in the middle of a story. So Pinchas, which is the name of the Torah portion, his story actually ends at the end of the last portion and keeps going into this one, and then it changes gears, as you know that sometimes there's 3 or 4 or 5 different topics in one Torah portion. So here's what's going on in this one. God is telling Moses how to prepare for his death, and he gives him one last opportunity to climb up to the mountain, look over the promised land from afar, because he will not be going into the promised land. I'm not going to talk about that, though. Another part of the Torah portion talks about a census that is being taken, parceling out the land to the men of the tribes. And if you read Olivier's Torah Reflections in your email, he talks about this. The daughters of Zelophehad challenged this rule, claiming that just because there was no male heir didn't mean that they had no rights to their father's land. Not going to talk about that either. Near the end of the portion, God tells Moses when and what offerings to present during each festival: Passover, Sabbath, the new moon, the festival of weeks, the atonement, a lot of burnt animal offerings. Not going to talk about that. I'm vegan, just for you who don't know. What I am going to talk about is the part of the portion where Moses, knowing that he's going to die, asks God to find someone to replace him and lead the people of Israel into the promised land after he's gone. God chooses Joshua and instructs Moses to lay his hands upon him and bless him in front of all the other Israelites. So it is presented that Joshua is the leadership heir apparent. This is what I'm going to talk about. So why Joshua? Why not any of Moses' descendants or Aaron's? Actually, Pinchas is the grandson of Aaron, so, family bloodline, right? Legacy to get in. Well, I'm not going to talk about that either. So we're given hints along the way in the Torah that Joshua's demonstrating traits of a good leader, even though he wasn't really vying for the position. But as far as God was concerned, Joshua had proved himself in many situations and in many different ways. For example, Moses had constructed the tent of meeting as a temporary headquarters, per se, before the tabernacle was built. And this was the place where the Israelites would come for wisdom and guidance from Moses, where Moses would commune with God. Joshua was also in the tent and actually would stay there when Moses would go back out into the camp and be amongst the people. Servant leadership. Joshua had led the Jews to destroy Amalek. After that battle, when God asks Moses to chronicle the event, God said, make sure that Joshua hears it, how Moses is chronicling the event. Authoritarian leadership. I'm going to talk about different types of leadership. Just stick with me. When Moses went up to Mount Sinai, where he stayed for 40 days, 40 nights, Joshua was the only one to accompany him and watch out for him as Moses went to the very top to commune with God. He stayed at the bottom of the mountain. And then when Moses came down the mountain, it was Joshua who alerted Moses about what had been going on in the camps while Moses was up at a higher elevation, the golden calf and all that. Joshua was the one who had tipped him off to that. Transactional leadership. Remember the story when Moses sent spies into the promised land to scope it out, and nearly everybody came back saying, oh, there's monsters, it's unsafe, we got to turn around, it's not good. Except for two of them, Caleb and Joshua. And they urged Moses, don't listen to the fear-mongering, trust in God and the promise he made to his people. Transformational leadership. Now, as a side note, Joshua and Caleb, in the end, were the only two Israelites born in slavery. You may have heard Olivier talk about this several times, that, during the 40 years of wandering, it kind of organically eliminated a generation of people who had been born in slavery, the idea being that we needed to leave the slave consciousness out of the promised land. So those who were born free would then enter the promised land with a clear consciousness. Caleb and Joshua were the only two that had actually been born as slaves, yet were able to carry that perspective into the promised land. Sometimes you don't know hot unless you understand cold. Sometimes you don't understand light until you've understood darkness. Maybe that was a reason. Another reason that God thought it was important. There was that thread to the past, the understanding of where they had come from and where they are going to. And even though Joshua was kind of Moses' right-hand man, proved himself in many situations, he didn't challenge Moses to a duel. He didn't challenge Moses' leadership. He actually defended Moses on many occasions. He could have let his ego drive him to confront Moses, but he never did. Democratic leadership. So these stories provide us examples, different types of leaderships that show us Joshua's commitment, clarity of focus, humility, courage, and faith. Now, I alluded to some of the different types of leadership styles. There's the servant leadership. This focuses on addressing the needs of the group, providing guidance and compassion. Some people in the clergy may frame their work in this manner: I am your servant. Democratic leadership, which is, good in theory. This type of leader prefers to engage in a collaborative process, encouraging different ideas while working towards consensus, making sure all members feel like they are part of the process. The reality is, sometimes, depending on the situation, you don't always have the luxury of time for a democratic process to play out. That sometimes, also in a democracy, very little gets done because everybody's arguing all the time. Everyone's stuck. Now, authoritarian leadership. We're familiar with this, for better or for worse. Recent and long ago past. Many examples. This type of leadership often likes to exert power over others, make unilateral decisions without input. Now, that being said, there are times where this type of leadership is needed. Well, for instance, one could say that Moses was authoritarian. There wasn't a lot of democracy when he said, okay, we're leaving now, we're going to cross through that river, we're going to be wandering around, we're going to wander now 40 years, and he just said, here's what we're doing. God said we're doing this, we're doing this. If you're a parent, guardian, teacher, sometimes the authoritarian approach is needed to keep kids safe, to keep other people safe. And I admit, I've said maybe once, maybe twice as a parent, just because I said so, right? Just because I said so. When you have children that are very little, why? It's just not a democracy. Sometimes it's just not a democracy. So authoritarian may have a negative connotation, but sometimes it needs to happen. If all of a sudden we were attacked in some way, shape, or form, we wouldn't necessarily have time to discuss this in debate, how to respond. Let's take a vote. We need, sometimes you need a leader who just needs to act. Transformational leadership. Those are the people who inspire through their vision. Motivational speakers fall into this category. Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, right? There's just something about the message that is transformative. There's the charismatic leaders. Sometimes these can cross over. These are ones where it's not just about the message, it's the delivery style of the message. Dr. Martin Luther King, charismatic leader. It was not the message, it was also the messenger. Again, sometimes that runs into trouble when the charisma of a leader crosses very much into ego territory. There's transactional leadership. We tend to see this in business, clear measure of success, failure, hierarchy, right? There's a chain of command. We see that type of leadership in businesses, but also kind of with this whole startup phenomenon, the laissez-faire leadership, hands-off approach. Here's what you need to do. As long as you get it done by deadline, I'm not going to micromanage you. I trust that you're going to get it done. So many different types of leadership styles. Is one better than the other? Maybe it depends on the circumstance, the environment. Everyone may have its place and its time. In a spiritual context, several types of leaderships have emerged, authoritative to transformative to charismatic, for better, for worse. So now I'm going to flip the coin. Not only what type of leadership do you work with or under, many different circumstances, within a family dynamic, within a partnership dynamic, within a work dynamic, community. But what type of leader are you? All of us at some point have had to step into a leadership role, like it or not, even if it's just for a few moments, and even if it's outside of our comfort zone. We've all had to do it. Maybe your leadership style harvests traits from the charismatic, the laissez-faire, the democratic, the servant. Now, remember, Joshua did not ask to take Moses' place. Actually, if you remember, Moses didn't want the gig either, right? So there's where the humility comes in, right? Some of the challenges when we become leaders or people become leaders goes to the ego. Moses was not ego-driven for this job, and neither was Joshua. A reluctant leader. Each of those characters in the stories, Moses, Joshua, they just simply walked their truth. They walked their path. True to their beliefs, steadfast, living their lives with humility, clarity, loyalty, faith, not driven by ego. And maybe that's how simple it is. Maybe if we simply walk our path with these qualities, we will end up leading organically just by demonstrating a positive example. And maybe that is the best leadership style of all.